Welcome to week 21 of the Objectivism book study. I'm Cody Leibold, and we are reading in the middle of chapter 7 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. We are looking this week at pages 213 to 229. Our topics are man's life as the standard of moral value and rationality as the primary virtue. What is at stake in what we are talking about this week for Christians? Well, we're watching the evangelical movement seemingly collapsing in a lot of ways. Individual churches compromising or becoming weak and diluted, the institutions and known leaders compromising, capitulating. Matt Marino, the Reformed classicalist, gave a perfect summary of the challenges that American evangelicals are facing. So I thought I would share his whole comment here. One day, there's going to be a whole body of literature on the psychological anomaly of the late modern evangelical pseudo-male. Long before there was a gender transitioning, the effeminate pragmatist, quote, teaching of churches transitioned the old kind of male into a delicate suburban dweller that could only cringe at what used to be considered normal Christian speech. Whole portions of Scripture were simply omitted from the pastor's expected preaching material. Civilization-maintaining ethics were removed from seminary curriculum. New virtues were conceived around the new kind of consumer produced. Yes, he was a consumer, not a disciple. Similarly, new vices served to chase away the memory of that old thing called man, lest any emerged from their exile to recolonize the church. The text of Scripture were still selectively canvassed. Carefully curated portions of the old thinkers were allowed to the degree that they could be mined for, quote, personal devotional purposes. But the manly culture-moving categories of the Christian mind were translated. What was left was 3 generations of churchgoers who could no longer hear the advancing drumbeat of the kingdom of Christ. Like water to fish, the plausibility structure of the evangelical mind is less able to think of ultimate things than the unbelievers around us, to whom we are supposed to be a living confrontation with the transcendent and the momentous. In the absence of such modes of thought, in which pagans like Plato and Cicero were more versed than our teachers, what we have is nothing short of a psychological disorder, an inability to cope with difficult things and insensitivity to act on the most basic moral instincts, not only of moral outrage, but even of self-preservation. Where our ancestors would have long since exhausted the pen and the tongue in pleading controversy and then moved without hesitation to prepare the gallows where they had a majority, or the ships fleeing to other shores where they did not. Our own method is a never-ending grovel fest. Our only passion left is in appeasement, and our only gospel, peace, peace, when there is no peace. So for the reasons that Matt Marino stated, it is necessary to return to a robust Christianity, an actual Christianity, for those who love the truth, and who love to look at God's book truthfully. And in order to do that, at FTNCI, we find it useful to engage with the work of Ayn Rand. This week in particular, as we look at the idea that man's life is the standard of moral value for him, and as we look at the idea that rationality is man's primary virtue for him, we do it with an eye toward restoring a sound and truthful vision of man, a view that requires common sense and courage. Matt Marino spoke of contact with the transcendent, with the momentous. He pointed out that pagans like Plato and Cicero were more versed than our evangelical teachers in thinking about such things. He was right. And among the pagans, Ayn Rand also had something unique and valuable to say about these topics that Matt was discussing. Self-preservation, the sense of life, the sense of value, the sense of striving, moving forward, winning, conquering, escaping, setting up gallows if necessary, or escape ships if necessary, in order that we would preserve the kind of civilization that is worth having. Compare that to what we saw in the news this week. Tragedy happened this week with the police apparently not acting the way they should have. We don't know all the details, and I would be very slow to make any evaluations about the details. But when police don't step in and play the hero, and when they prevent others from playing the hero, apparently, what can be said about our society? What can be said about our future? We need to restore a sense of man that has at its core a desire to live, a desire to be a hero. And so for that, we're going to turn to this page 213, Man's Life as the Standard of Moral Value. I submit that there is no other core value that you could hold that would give us the ability to live as God has created us to live than to value your own life. I think this is consonant with what Scripture says. I also think that it is what was known by common sense to the pagans and to the first Christians and to ancient Israel, and that it's only not known to those of our Kantian generation. So I'd like to take a moment. I'm going to add someone on camera, and then I'm going to ask if anyone has any comments about topics we need to mention in the reading. This would be a good time.
So Cody, I was just excited about this part of the chapter when it talks about man's life as the standard of moral value, because I find that if there is anything that Christians can relate to objectivists on, it is pursuing life and holding that as one of the highest values. I think there are some objectivists who, when I try to integrate some of those principles into my life, they sort of reject me, like, no, you're a Christian, you don't belong here. Well, I'm not trying to bring my theology into their objectivism. I'm just trying to bring some of their principles into my life and integrate it as such. And, what else could be more pivotal than the desire to live eternally and the desire to live here on earth to the fullest that I can with all the grace and the gifts from God, that living with God in my life is so much more fulfilling than when I choose not to have God in my life. And so if there's anything that I can sort of relate on a personal level with people who are adherents of this philosophy, that's one of them.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I agree. And it's something that you see in the writing of Rand, that she understood this about Christians, at least, that Christians were following what they thought was value. Now, she disagrees with them about whether it is a value, but she at least sees what I see in the scriptures, that there are promises of a life that is worth living and then eternal life. And sometimes they may ridicule this idea of, oh, it's just rewards in heaven. But at least they will acknowledge that Christianity is a religion that preaches rewards. And they'll at least preach that it's rewards for the individual, which is something that Rand is actually, she's acknowledged that Christianity had an individualizing effect on society. It had the effect of promoting individualism as an idea, because each man is supposed to care for the well-being of his own soul. This is something that in collectivist societies, you didn't always find this idea of needing to care most for your own soul rather than for the state and the collective. There is a lot that is consonant between these two views, and we'll see in greater detail what we're able to agree with or disagree with. So let's go into page 213. The header here is Man's Life as the Standard of Moral Value. Peikoff writes about the difference between plants and animals and human beings. Plants and animals initiate automatically the actions that their life requires. At the bottom of that page, he says, man, however, is the living being with a volitional, conceptual consciousness. So remember that key point about man being capable of choice, which means that when we seek our values, we only do it by choice, unless we're talking about autonomic functions of our bodies. So Peikoff writes, he does not automatically value or pursue self-preservation. And then skipping a little ahead, the desire to live in the knowledge of what life requires is an achievement, not a biological gift. Compare that to, I don't know, say birds, or compare it to lizards or something. We have to use our minds in order to determine what we need. Top of page 214, man, writes Ayn Rand, has to hold his life as a value by choice. He has to learn to sustain it by choice. So it's not only just that we have to use our cognition and our volitional consciousness in order to know what things are, but we also have to ask ourselves, well, what kinds of things do we need? Dogs and cats, they know without this conceptual faculty what's good for them and what's not, for the most part. Human beings, have to work every step of the way to identify what's good for them and what's not. And that's why, say, a baby horse or baby deer is born and it's pretty much ready to live as long as it has its mother around for a while. But a baby human being would never become ready to live unless there were years of training. So we have to learn to practice our virtues by choice. Morality, in Ayn Rand's definition, is a code of values accepted by choice. I think this term code of values is helpful. Code of values, it's a set of ideas, a set of general ideas, principles. So he needs these in order to survive. And this is not disputable. Moral laws in this view are principles that define how to nourish and sustain human life. They are no more than this and no less. So that's a very sweeping claim to say that moral principles only are principles defining how to nourish and sustain human life. No more and no less. We'll be able to get a chance to interact with that idea, but that's one of the questions on my mind as I read this is necessary and sufficient, no more and no less. Really, is that the extent of it? Is that the definition of it? So we read on, morality is the instruction manual in regard to proper care and use that did not come with man. It is the science of human self-preservation. Another huge sweeping claim. Morality is simply the science of self-preservation. Now, if you understand how Rand is going to define self as being this rational creature, not just living by any means, but living only in the way suitable for man, you'll understand that there is some qualifications, and you understand what the definition is of what they envision. So Peikoff goes on, plants and animals pursue values, but not moral values. They have goals, but not ethics. Moral values are chosen values of a fundamental nature. They shape a man's character and life course. That's what he means by fundamental. Then he contrasts moral values versus more specific values, like your values of what kind of art you like, what kind of government you think is correct. But moral values are more fundamental than that. You're not asking what kind of laws we should have. You're asking what kind of approach to living and producing you should have in general as a human being, as an individual. This next section, we get into analysis. At the bottom of 214, man needs to act long range. So let's analyze this idea that we've been describing. First, he says man needs to live long range. That means allowing for extending into the distant future. This is a point that I had to read Rand quite a bit before I fully appreciated the significance of this point. Rand will often derogate her opponents by saying that they are living on the range of the moment. You can see that in Atlas Shrugged. The villains in Atlas Shrugged are only interested in the next month or perhaps even the next week. They're not thinking, in principle, what's going to happen if we continue this policy indefinitely? Man needs to act long range. And this is why I always, when I try to explain what a man is, I try to say man is the long range conceptual being that lives by productivity, that uses his mind to produce. But I always want to point out that it's long range. So Peikoff writes, this kind of man sets goals that demand action across a significant time span. And being concerned with such goals, he also weighs consequences, the future consequences of his present behavior. Now, this is not only relevant to the idea of what would happen if I continued making this choice in my business or in producing something. It's also relevant to the idea of if I become the kind of person who does this kind of thing in principle, what kind of person will I become? We're not merely talking about what kind of work we have to do, but also what kind of people we have to be. And moral principles will relate to this idea. It'll relate to, do you have to keep your body physically fit? Do you have to keep your mind clean and hygienic and sane? Or are you allowed to let yourself turn into a nervous wreck? Are you allowed to make little cutting corners mentally? Are you allowed to cheat in your mind? Are you allowed to be an immoral person? But we don't want to be circular when we define morality. So when we talk about morality here, we're not just going to assume we know what morality is. We're going to say, am I allowed to operate against principles that I know will affect me for the better in the long range? That's really what we're asking when we speak of morality. See, that way we're not defining it circularly. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
One way that you could use this principle to kind of help you understand some of Rand's ethics is to say that you're faced with a tough choice. And I've talked on Twitter before about how I like the show Better Call Saul because it demonstrates a lot of the principles of cause and effect and consequences of our actions. You might be able to concoct a situation where you may not get caught if you do something immoral. Let's say that you have the opportunity to take something that doesn't belong to you and no one would ever find out, and you have enough information to know that you would be found out. In that situation, it might seem like to do the right thing is to not look out for yourself, right? Is to say, don't do the thing that's good for you, do the thing that's just right. And those things might seem like they might be separated in that case. But I was thinking about this earlier this week. In that situation where you're faced with that dilemma, the thing that you need most is not the object that you want to steal. What you need most is to make a choice that's going to put you on a path towards becoming the kind of person who makes the right choice. You might tell yourself, well, this one time isn't going to damage me that much. It's not going to damage my character that much. But you don't really know that. You never really know that, because think about the nature of habit formation. You're always damaging. If you break a habit, it takes a long time to get back. If you've done the right thing 20 times in a row, doing it the wrong way once can be devastating for your long-term success and cultivating that habit. So even when faced in difficult situations where it looks like personal gain is going to come from the wrong thing, the morally wrong choice, you need to tell yourself, what I need more than this thing that I seek to gain here is to make myself into a better person in this moment. And that's a good way of understanding that life is the standard, even in those situations where it looks like you could get away with something.
That is an outstanding point. Thank you for that. You need to steward your own sense of self-respect, because what happens if you lose self-respect? We'll get into that in greater detail. We'll be able to discuss this idea of why you must be moral. There's a practical need to follow a certain course of action, is what we're saying. So in the middle of 215, we read consistency in regard to any goal beyond the perceptual level or the routine cannot be achieved by sense perception, conscious habit, or luck. It can be achieved only by the aid of explicit values and knowledge. The next section, no action an organism takes is irrelevant to its existence. And then he compares taking a nap in one context. You're tired after work, that's okay, but you couldn't take a nap on the job, you couldn't take a nap during a blizzard. You have to take into account your context. Bottom of the page, every choice has effects which redound directly or indirectly on one's ability to survive. And then he writes, so life is motion, and he writes, if the motion is not self-preserving, then it is self-destroying. Now there are some areas where you have plenty of options. Like, it's not to say that every hour and every minute of your life involves working on a specific challenge for your survival. Sometimes the option is, do you prefer to just read a book for entertainment, or watch a TV show for entertainment, or sit around and have a conversation, or sip tea? You have lots of options, but every one of those must be evaluated in terms of, are they hurting you or not? Because if you even just stop thinking about, is this hurting me, for just 5 minutes, and you do whatever you feel like doing on the basis of whatever argument or criteria you choose, and it's not, is this hurting me or helping me? Even for 5 minutes, you might not survive. You might drink laundry detergent. And you would never do that. Your body and your mental habits would immediately stop you from doing that. What I'm pointing out is that your body and your mental habits are all set up toward this goal of survival. That's the pattern that has been built over time. And don't overlook that. That's no small point. That your psychological apparatus and your physical apparatus are all oriented in this way. Top of page 216, Peikoff writes, there is such a thing as drawn-out destruction, of course, like alcoholism or other dangerous behaviors. And we'll get into that a little bit more in detail. He describes it later. Middle of 216, no threat to vitality, no undermining of one's capacity to deal successfully with the environment can be countenanced if life is the standard of value. None. Teenagers that take a knife to their arm and just make cutting marks, that doesn't kill you, but it is detrimental to your survival. Not just in the immediate physical sense that you could get germs in your body or that you're possibly damaging your arm long range. There's other reasons as well. This kind of behavior, if you start doing it, then you have to ask yourself, what principle am I doing this behavior on? And what would happen if I continued in this same principle? And if you were to continue it, then eventually you'd get even more destructive. Bottom of the page, an animal cannot grasp or deal with the total of its lifespan. It does not need to. But he writes, man's life is a continuous whole for good or evil every day, year and decade of his life, holds the sum of all the days behind him. And that's why we're different from animals. I mean, if you were to imagine a goose that one day decided it was going to engage in cutting on its legs, it was going to cut. Okay, well, the goose doesn't have this mental framework, consistency over time. It doesn't have this self-identity the way we do as conscious, conceptual, long-range human beings. Compare if that were to happen to an animal versus if it were to happen to a human being. What does it do to your mind, your self-worth, your self-estimate? What does it do to your concept of what kind of person you are, what you do, what you value? That's what's at stake. Top of 217. He can assess not merely the proximate, but also the remote consequences of his choices. So Peikoff compares the short cycles of animals' lives to the entire career span and lifespan of a man. And Rand writes, if he is to succeed at the task of survival, man has to choose his course, his goals, his values, in the context, in the terms of a lifetime. Man must be long range. He must know the survival significance of every action he takes. I don't think this is too controversial of a point. And I think in the reading today, there's going to be a lot of material like this where it's, okay, I get it. So Peikoff writes, man can achieve the long-range outlook he needs only by the use of concepts. If man is to sustain and protect his life, he must conceptualize the requirements of human survival. Bottom of the page, what generalizations identify in condensed retainable form the effect of man's life in different kinds of choices? Well, the answer would be moral principles, like a code of value. So we get to 218. He says that a principle is a general truth on which other truths depend. In one of the lectures I listened to, Peikoff was saying a general principle needs to be not something that's very small, like make sure not to miss the bus. That's too specific. It doesn't count as a general principle. A general principle would be more like when you need to accomplish some goal, you need to ask yourself, what are the means by which I'll accomplish it? That's not a particularly concise formulation. That's never going to be a famous maxim. But you could think of famous maxims, the means must suit the ends, something like that. It summarizes that same idea. Now, that applies in the case of don't miss your bus, but it also applies in the case of show up on time to work or eat your breakfast in the morning. Those are smaller applications, and you wouldn't call those principles because they're just not general enough.
I would say that some, but not all, of the proverbs in the biblical book of Proverbs are general principles, and some of them are sort of zoomed in to a narrower level of focus to a certain aspect of life, like finance or work. But a lot of them are very general principles, and you can see that because, you know, the cause and effect is not going to come true every single time, but as a general principle, it is.
Yeah, I agree. And they're concretes in the way they're stated, but they are analogies. So there are a lot of principles in the Proverbs where you realize he's not just talking about one thing. He wants you to think about how this could apply to other settings as well. For instance, several Proverbs about how it's better to have peace in your home rather than to be completely wealthy. And they tell it in different ways. You know, you want to live on the corner of your roof rather than be fighting with your wife or things like that. But these proverbs would apply in a different setting as well, in your career outside of the house. It's the kind of thing that they put it in concrete terms because it's more memorable. That's what the Bible is quite good at. That's actually something that if we want to encourage people to think about philosophy and principles, we need to get really good at taking general ideas and turning them into memorable either parables or visual images. They need to follow the copywriting advice, which is that they need to pass the Spielberg test. When we communicate, we need to communicate in such a way that Steven Spielberg, if he were to read what we just wrote, he would know exactly what to film if you were making a movie. It needs to be visual, concrete, and actually the Proverbs are an outstanding example of that. I think that you can get the sense of it more if you read them out loud, if you read them slowly, if you really think about it, what kind of scene it's painting. Go ahead, Jennifer.
If we're trying to define that which is morality and includes the choice to act, and the choice to act in a way that serves our rational self-interest, then aren't there choices that some people could make? The choice to do physical activity every single day, let's say, for example. In one case, that person's daily physical activity is really life-sustaining and fantastic and really does serve their rational self-interest long range. But maybe for the other person, it's almost an addiction to do the daily physical activity. And it's not in their self-interest because it's like a compulsion, or they're doing it to the detriment of something else in their life. And so how can you decide that a certain activity is moral or not moral because it suits each person's needs differently? Does that make sense?
Yes, this is a pretty complicated question. It reminds me of, in this book later on, I think it is, that they bring up the topic of imagine hypothetically that there's a kid that was thinking about what career he wanted to do, and imagine his society makes him take a test, and it turns out that he's very well suited to be a doctor according to the test, but he never wanted to be a doctor. If he were to be pushed into that by the fact that he was good at the test, but not the fact that he chose it, his career would not be one that he believes in. And so this points us to the idea that your moral values are things that must be accepted by choice. We can't overlook the role of volition. And so, same way with choosing your spouse, your hobbies, your relative balance of the different activities in your life, if you didn't choose that it would be that way, that takes away from it actually being a value. So the fact that you choose it doesn't mean that it's actually life-sustaining. But in order for something to be a life-sustaining value, a correctly chosen value that is suited to human existence, it has to be something that is based on the reality of our survival needs, and it has to be something that is accepted by choice. And so you'll see this in the reading. Morality is a code of values accepted by choice. That's consistent with the definition that we saw last week with values. Values are what one acts to gain or keep. So keep in mind that the term value in Rand's usage could be quite general. Someone could value smoking cigarettes. It doesn't specify whether or not that's going to achieve a life-reinforcing end. But objective values, values that are rational, would be something that the person accepts by choice and that has a life-serving end. Now, how do you choose the relative balance of the activities of your life? How do you choose how much in shape you need to be? That's a topic that has a lot of leeway because each individual person has their own psychology and their own value structure. There are some lectures in Ayn Rand Institute website. You can find some lectures about values that actually address this head on. They say, let's talk about this topic of how different people would have different careers. It's not the case that everybody that accepts objectivism as a philosophy needs to go into architecture or manufacturing steel. Why not? Or they don't have to go into writing or being a public intellectual. So why not? There's a lot you could say about that. Yeah, Jennifer, did you have any more thoughts about that? I know it's just sort of a big topic.
It is really big. And when I was reading this, it just occurred to me, like, where can we find the objective morality to be able to say this is moral for that person, but not moral for that person? Or are you even like allowed to make that kind of judgment? I just kind of got a little bit lost, and maybe I just need to pursue some other lectures and materials.
I could offer something here. What you're identifying is evidence that there aren't going to be a ton of general principles that philosophy can give us. There are going to be big ones that cover almost every example, such as be rational. That's always going to be objective. Physical exercise. I should physically exercise every day is not, even though that is going to still be true for most people, there are too many exceptions to make that a general principle for universally. Because like you said, there could be someone who's addicted to exercise because of the dopamine, or someone who just had an injury, or someone who's too old. They need to maybe go for a walk, a 15-minute walk once a week if they're in their 80s or 90s. What you're getting at is that people's contexts are going to change so much. There aren't going to be 100 general principles. That's why Peikoff lists 3 here: reason, purpose, and self-esteem, because the incredible variety of options that people are faced with is going to give rise to a very different list of particular principles. Like for me, it's a good principle to get up before 8 o'clock. For someone else, it might not be. What if you work a night shift at a factory or something like that? That wouldn't make any sense. It seems like your concern is that it's going to be really hard in most cases to identify something that's going to be true for so many people, because people's contexts change so much. And keep in mind, objective, as defined in this book, means a relationship between a person and reality. It doesn't just mean something in reality. It doesn't just mean a way of thinking. It means a way of thinking that relates a person to reality. It has to have both elements to qualify as objective, as he defines it here.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much.
And if we're looking for more principles, we're going to get in the coming chapters to the section on what the different virtues are. And Ayn Rand will name 7 virtues, rationality being one, but then there's also independence and integrity, honesty, and there's 7. It'd be nice if I had them all off the top of my head, but let's see what we have. Independence, justice, and a couple others, right? Productivity and pride, she names as a virtue. So those are principles that are broad enough that they're going to apply to every person. Whereas the concept of I have to eat this kind of diet or I have to exercise, it can't be a general principle that's going to apply to every person. I'd also just want to add to everything, and I agree with everything you guys have been saying, I want to add judging other people's choices on this is a very difficult thing. You can look at somebody who is clearly committing to a process of self-destruction and you can say they have not been acting in the moral way here. But before evaluating somebody else, you would need to know quite a bit about the pattern of their life. There may be reasons why somebody physically isn't as strong as somebody else that you have no idea about. There may be reasons why somebody's overweight that you have no idea about. Those kinds of things. And so you can make a moral principle that says, strive to better yourself and to take care of yourself. You cannot make a moral principle that says, if you're 20 pounds overweight, you're a bad person. I mean, that's not correct. All right, so let's go to the middle of page 218. So he's talking about a principle is a general truth on which other truths depend. And he says, every science and every field of thought involves the discovery and application of principles. Leaving aside certain special cases, a principle may be described as a fundamental reached by induction. I think the special cases he's talking about are the axioms. Next paragraph. A moral principle, he writes, is a type of scientific principle identifying the relationship to man's survival of the various basic human choices. For a rational being, principled action is the only effective kind of action. To be principled is the only way to achieve a long-range goal. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. He writes, moral principles are not luxuries reserved for, quote, higher souls or duties owed to the supernatural. Okay, so he's taking a pot shot at Christianity again. They are practical, earthly necessity to anyone concerned with self-preservation. Now, the way I understand moral principles, I actually agree with him here. I think that what he should be rejecting, if he were to name it, would be the divine command theory of ethics. Jacob and I reject the divine command theory. We actually think that the 10 commandments are the 10 words. That's how the Jews describe them. They don't call them the 10 commandments. They call them the 10 words given to us as the path to life. That's how they're intended. And so whenever the objectivists critique the 10 commandments or Christian morality, and they say it's just God just telling us we have to do something for the sake of it, just a just so story, I look at that and say, no, I mean, that may be what you heard in your synagogue or your church, but that's not what you see if you open the pages.
I just wanted to say, when you go through the catechism, or even if you just read the 10 commandments, many of them actually have a reason attached to them. They have a reason why you should do them. And that's why I would say there is no conflict between saying, the 10 commandments or morality can be both a means for living on an earthly material life, and they're also our duty towards God. Once we understand that our duty towards God is to image forth his glory and to be his image bearers, those two things are not in conflict. But if what he means here, and it likely is, if what he means here is, just obeying for the sake of, blind obedience with no personal understanding, then yeah, those things would be at odds.
Excellent. Jennifer, did you have something you want to come on and say as well?
It's so great to hear you say that. I don't think in everything I've read or watched that I've heard you say that explicitly, but I recently did have an objectivist ask me, like, why are you even interested in this as a Christian? And I said, because when I argue with people about politics, moral choices in politics, the argument, because God said so, is not satisfactory to me. I don't think that's sufficient, especially when you live in such a godless community. You have to find a way that can convince them or persuade them or somebody else maybe listening that there is a moral choice there objectively, because God said so, isn't acceptable to so many people that you really do have to find out there's got to be something, there's got to be a moral code that is applicable to people who reject God. And I love that about this philosophy.
Ben Shapiro has a principle about that. He says that you should be able to give a secular argument. If you're a religious person and you're talking about political topics and you're trying to persuade other people that are not of the same religion, they don't embrace the same authority and the same text as you, you need to be able to give a secular argument for why abortion is wrong, for those kinds of things. And it's the opposite of the presuppositionalist view. Remember our discussion in previous weeks about the arbitrary. If your goal is to persuade somebody else to believe in this specific political point, you should not be making arbitrary appeals to your sacred text. Just as it would be ridiculous if somebody that believed in the Quran were to come to me and say, well, here's why you need to vote this way, because my Quran says this. I'd say, why would I care? And this is a mystery to a lot of pastors and a lot of Christians that you see on social media. You hear them react to this policy and they say, well, we should just preach the gospel to them. We should get them converted. And I'm thinking, why do you make this assumption that everything that you say publicly ought to be oriented first toward getting people to understand the gospel, and that only after they're in your church, then you can teach them right and wrong by making arguments appealing to general revelation? And by the way, these same people, once they get them in the church, do you think that they're going to tell them right and wrong? To some extent, maybe, but if you're silencing yourself now, when are you going to stop silencing yourself? Go ahead, Andrew, I saw you raising your hand.
Could I also suggest that, Jennifer, your motivation, I love that idea that, you want to be able to give, like Ben Shapiro says, you want to be able to give a secular argument for your religious preferences and politics. But let's say that we're living in the forever after. Evil has been vanquished from the face of the earth. We would still want to know exactly why we're doing what we're doing, because that's part of God's plan, is for us to understand him and know him and love him. I mean, don't you love God more when you start to piece it together and say, wow, it's amazing how he created this all to work together? You glorify him so much more than just saying, I actually don't think this works at all, but because I've talked myself into it for some reason, I'm going to do it, So it applies certainly when you're speaking to non-Christians, but I think even beyond that, it has application for the Christian.
It's outstanding. Reading forward in the book now, we're still on 218. Peikoff writes, a moral principle is a type of scientific principle, identifying the relationship of man's survival to the various basic human choices. Then he says, for a rational being, principled action is the only effective kind of action. To be principled is the only way to achieve a long-range goal. Then he gets into this material on pragmatism. Now, there's only a very small mention of pragmatism here. There will be more mention of it later. But the short-range only way of approaching these issues could be called pragmatism. It tells people to judge not by reference to abstract theory, but by results that you see immediately. And every situation needs to be grasped on its own terms. There's a lot we could say about pragmatism, but that's an important philosophical trend that is taken over in our political discourse, in our Congress. It's also taken over in our churches. Top of page 219, Rand is describing what a code is: integrated, hierarchically structured, non-contradictory system of principles which enables man to choose, plan, and act long range. So this is setting us up to understand, once we get into the different virtues, why we need to have an integrated approach, why we need to have in our mind a system of some kind. And Rand's system of 7 virtues, she didn't say these are the only ones. She just said these are ones that I know that I can validate. This is some of the principles that I can be sure are true. So it's not a rationalistic approach. It's just an inductive approach. Peikoff writes, he needs a moral code because his life requires a specific course of action, and being a conceptual entity, he cannot follow this course except by the guidance of concepts. There's some material in here that's pretty dense, but I do think it's important to cover. So a code based on reason and proper to man must hold man's life as the standard of value. To quote Rand on that, all that which is proper to the life of a rational being is good. All that which destroys it is evil. When I hear her say something like that, I think, oh, okay, that's a huge sweeping claim. Is she just defining it this way? And if so, is that something that is grounded in reality? Did she just basically throw out 2,000 years of history of what the term morality means and just say, no, I've decided now that it means, when I say good, I mean that which is proper to a rational being. And when I say bad, I mean that which destroys rational beings. Is she just redefining it that way? Or does she have some basis in reality for this definition? We've seen in the preceding, say, 30 or 50 pages, the basis for this kind of approach. What would it mean to speak of good or bad if it wasn't in reference to life? So I think that she actually is being objective here. Man's survival qua man means, in Ayn Rand's definition, the terms, methods, conditions, and goals required for the survival of a rational being through the whole of his lifespan in all those aspects of existence which are open to his choice. Stated another way, man's life means life in accordance with the principles of human survival. The emphasis on the human here, because we're talking about a code for human beings. So it has to be a code that makes the way for human survival, not survival as animals or zombies, not survival as Nebuchadnezzar when God cursed him for 7 seasons. Nebuchadnezzar turned into almost like an animal. He had claws, his hair turned so it looks like feathers. Nebuchadnezzar crawled on all fours until after 7 seasons he looks up and then he remembers God. And then God humbled him. The picture of Nebuchadnezzar living as an animal is very similar to the picture of the pragmatists living. The picture that you see in Atlas Shrugged of the politicians, the moochers, the looters. The picture of somebody that only lives day to day. The picture that you see in, say, The Big Lebowski, the dude who wears his bathrobe wherever he goes and drinks beer all day and probably smokes pot. That kind of life is not suitable to somebody who's thinking long range. What we're talking about when we talk about morality is long-range principles for life. So Peikoff writes, the long-range survival of man, mind and body. That's what we're talking about. The standard is not just staying alive by any means. He says once we speak in long-range terms, there is only one means. So in other words, this is a matter of just being consistent. You cannot say my standard is survival as a man without also including in there long-range, over time, doing the things that are necessary in order to make sure that I preserve my mind. You have to take your mind with you over that journey. Otherwise, there's not going to be a journey because of what kind of thing you are. So this all can be demonstrated by reference to just natural law. Now, Ayn Rand puts it, the standard is not survival at any price, since there's only one price that pays for man's survival: reason. This reminds me of another quote about, somebody once said, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. And I think it was Sidney Hook said, well, that might be true for dogs, but not for human beings. And Peikoff agrees with him there, and Rand agrees that it's man's life as a man that is the standard, not just life as a dog or as Nebuchadnezzar on all fours. So man's life is not a separate or higher ideal arbitrarily added to life. Life for any creature means life as that creature, life in accordance with a specific means of survival. To be, for man, means to be a man, right? Okay, we go on to the next heading. So deep breath. Rationality as the primary virtue. So since we already know that we're talking about man's life, well then clearly when we're talking about what the virtues are, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is man? Man being the rational creature, in order to live as man, in principle, he must live as a rational man. I think this is self-explanatory once you think about the meaning of the ideas involved. So what are the principles of human survival? Well, he's asking about what are the values, what are the virtues. Those are useful terms. Values, which we act to gain and keep. Virtues is the means by which we act to keep them. So the faculty of reason is man's basic tool of survival, writes Peikoff. The primary choice is to exercise this faculty or not. If life is the standard, therefore the basic moral principle is obvious. And that tells us the proper evaluation of reason. Reason is the highest value, and rationality is the highest virtue. That's how they use those terms. This is completely controversial in Christianity, isn't it? Because in Christianity, they would say the highest value is humility, or the highest virtue is humility, or they might say love, or kindness toward others, or self-sacrifice and selflessness. Some people would even go that far. But no, rationality, which means that if you apply this idea consistently, go back to Adam and Eve, and you say, well, what happened with Adam and Eve? What was their sin? Their sin was irrationality. Every sin on this scheme, which I endorse, must be understood in terms of irrationality. Every sin is an example of irrationality. So then Rand writes, to live, man must hold three things as the supreme ruling values of his life. So remember, these are the values. That would be reason, purpose, and self-esteem. Those are going to translate into three different virtues. Later on, we'll see reason. If you try to translate that into a virtue, that would be rationality. Purpose translates into productivity as a virtue. And the value of self-esteem turns into the virtue of pride. Self-esteem has a silly reputation in California and in the United States in general, because back in the 90s, they had these things called the esteem teams. And, people would wear shirts and dance on stage and do little skits in school about how it's okay to like yourself. And this almost seemed like a recipe for creating the opposite effect, because any kid that got involved in that club would probably be ridiculed by the other kids. So this term self-esteem, sadly, is no longer as useful to us rhetorically as it would have been before that movement. But if you think about self-esteem as the good kind of pride, I think that you can understand what she's saying. The good kind of pride, the pride that says, I am a value, my life is a value, I appraise myself morally as being good and worthy of living. Now, how can you ever do that if you don't have the blood of Christ? How can you ever do that if you have not been forgiven for your sins? I don't think you can. And so I think that if you're not a Christian and you try to have pride, you're going to end up with some neuroses. I think that you can see evidence for that if you look for it. But
or self-deception.
Yes, which is one form of neuroses. As you try to understand what she's saying here and what Peikoff is saying here, just keep in mind we as Christians are better suited than anyone else to have true pride in our new identity in Christ. We have the righteousness of Christ. He didn't just take away our sins, he gave us his righteousness. Now, that doesn't mean the pride that says, I'm going to push other people aside and tell them that they're beneath me. It's the pride that says, this is what I really am. I really am of value.
Pride that says, who can bring a charge against God's elect?
Love it. So, next section, epistemology tells us that reason is valid. It is man's means of knowledge. Ethics draws the practical conclusion, if one chooses to live, then one must hold reason as a value, relating those terms. Reason needs to be a personal value. It's not just a duty that you accept that was placed on you from some external source. Reason needs to be something that you love, something that when you think about 2 + 2 = 4, you think, I love the fact that my mind is capable of doing this. This is important to me personally. I care about this. And if you've observed babies and how seriously they take learning and observing, if you've talked to 4-year-old kids or 8-year-old kids who haven't had their self-worth beat out of them or removed in other ways like public school does, you'll realize that they have this hunger for life. The hunger that would make them more suitable for being hired than most millennials or most Gen Z people. They have a hunger to be able to do things, to be able to do them themselves. And that, Ayn Rand says, is the noblest act. The act of your mind in the process of grasping that 2 and 2 make 4. Peikoff talks about being uplifted by the spectacle of dry objectivity. The magnificent fire in Rand's ethics, her inspiring affirmations of man the hero, the root of that is its estimate of reason. So different from what our society tells us about reason. We have in our society the caricature of a scientist, a mad scientist, or the character of Gollum in Lord of the Rings. You know how Gollum is curious about everything, morbidly curious. And it's because he's become so curious about the inner workings of things that he goes down underneath the earth and he lives there for hundreds of years. Well, that's a stereotype of a certain kind of a person, the overthinker, similar to the mad scientist. And because he's pursued this hidden knowledge, he's become corrupt. There are people that think that the Garden of Eden story is a similar parable of you shouldn't have sought knowledge. Because you sought knowledge, you've become corrupt. And I'd say the objectivists, sometimes they caricature the Garden of Eden as that. But that's not actually what the Garden of Eden is saying. And I reject this idea that seeking the inner causes of things is a corrupting influence. It's not. And if you look at the way the world is right now, you'll see the results of what happens when men and societies and institutions fail to take seriously the question of the causes of things. So we go on. Every moral value entails a lifelong course of virtue, the action by which one gains or keeps a value. So rationality, we're talking about an action. Reason is the value. Rationality is the action, the virtue. Rationality is the recognition of and acceptance of reason as one's only source of knowledge, one's only judge of values, one's only guide to action. Does that mean I don't also listen to what the police tell me or what the stop signs say? No, of course I pay attention to the laws. Does that mean I don't listen to my professors? No, of course I do. Does that mean I don't read books? No, of course I do. But when we approach those things, how do we determine which ones are telling the truth and which ones are lying? How do we determine that the Bible is true and that the Quran is false? There's only one judge, and it's your own mind. Your mind has to judge. And so those people that reject autonomous human reasoning, I'd say, well, there's no other kind. To use the terms most consistently, it's helpful to speak of there's a differentiation between source of knowledge versus method of knowledge. The method of knowledge is what we're talking about here. Source would be whatever God is written in the Bible, whatever God has created in the world. I don't deny that God is the author and the revealer. But when it comes to the method of determining what's true or false, it has to be the individual person. What else would it be? Next, so we never place any consideration above one's perception of reality. He said so, or they won't like me if I say this or if I think this, is not a consideration. Reality is the consideration. So we never attempt to get away with a contradiction or a fantasy or an indulgence. We never try to get away with context dropping. Rationality means the acceptance of reason as a principle of human survival and as an absolute. Now this is how you can make Christians mad. You say that reason is an absolute. I accept the absolutism of reason. They're immediately going to fall apart. Rationality, writes Peikoff, is the primary obligation of man. All the others are derivatives of it. Why is that? Well, because as we discussed in previous week, our only unchosen obligation is to live. And what is it that's living? It's the rational creature. And so rationality is our obligation. This is basic. Page 222, there is only one primary vice, irrationality. That would mean willfully becoming unconscious, but still moving around and functioning. That's the issue, is like it's okay to take a nap, right? But what's not okay is to set your body in motion, but to turn your mind off. It's what the Bible talks about as willful ignorance. And that's the most dangerous course that an organism could take, writes Peikoff. So now we're going to ask, what does rationality entail? Rationality demands continual mental activity, a regular daily process of functioning on the conceptual level of consciousness. This is an important point. If somebody doesn't, from day to day, continue using their mind, if they let their mind go stagnant, passive, not closed, but inactive, then eventually they lose their capacity to live. They lose their capacity to make themselves into the kind of person who's suitable to live. I can't emphasize this point enough. We must always be learning. We must always be asking what's the cause. That is the kind of life that we live as human beings. And when we stop living that way, we become more like animals, but perhaps less than animals. So in Ayn Rand's description, basically it amounts to being observant and smart. Try to be smart. Try to be observant. But Rand says it a lot better than I do. It's a process of identifying your impressions in conceptual terms. It's a habit that when you see patterns, you try to identify them, integrate them, abstract into new concepts where necessary, make deductions where necessary, and so on. So the example here is Rourke, who is not a psychologist, recognizing that there is a principle at play when the dean is telling him, but you have to conform. That's the way everybody always does it. Well, Rourke wants to understand the dean, and so he files it as, oh, this is a weird trend. Someday I'll name it. And eventually, by the end of the story of the Fountainhead, Rourke names it as second-handedness. Bottom of 223, the moral point here is always to grow mentally. That doesn't mean that you have to be the smartest person in the world or the smartest person in your profession. It means you have to be growing. Bottom of the page, effort does not mean pain or duty, but it does mean struggle. You have to struggle. Top of 224, the men of virtue. are the men who choose to practice and welcome this kind of struggle on principle as a lifelong commitment. And now, if there is this connection between this struggle to learn and grow and virtue, then what does that also tell us by implication? If you're a public intellectual, if you're David Brooks or Ross Duhat at the New York Times, if you're Albert Mohler or Danny Akin, if you are Carl Trueman, Timothy Keller, Don Carson, if you are a public intellectual and you're stupid, which all these men are, if you're ignorant, which all these men are, if you're incompetent, which all these men are, and you remain that way over time and you continue putting yourself in front of other people and telling them this is how you should think, how can we evaluate such men? It's not just that they're incompetent, it's that they're lacking in virtue. Because the commitment to virtue involves the commitment to gaining knowledge over time. And if you put yourself out in front of other people and you make completely ignorant statements, like, for example, rejecting constitutional conservatism as just, that's just egoistic Randian libertarianism. This is what Albert Mohler does. If you're so ignorant about the principles of liberty and constitutional conservatism and free markets and capitalism, as Albert Mohler, you don't get that way just by accident. You get that way by a series of choices over time. And the choices that would cause somebody to be that ignorant while being that influential and that in front of other people, those choices are moral breaches. And so, when we evaluate these wicked institutional leaders, we are often asking ourselves the question, is he just dumb or is he vicious? And the point that I'm trying to make here is that I don't think we can separate those two things. I think that it takes a man of a certain level of moral viciousness to become so dumb as these men have become. Peikoff writes about the anti-effort mentalities. I think this is the explanation. The anti-effort mentality is how people became so dumb. And here he's ridiculing the Garden of Eden as if the Garden of Eden were a picture of the anti-effort mentality, which is completely false because, God's first command to Adam, his first charge to him was he was supposed to care for the garden, name the animals. That's actually conceptual work, naming the animals, caring for the garden. I don't see an anti-effort idea in the Garden of Eden.
Fill the earth and subdue it.
Right. So, yeah, dominate it.
That doesn't take your mind.
So, I'm sorry, but Peikoff, you didn't do your due diligence here on understanding the material that you're critiquing. I'm sorry. Nevertheless, we can agree that we should not elevate mental stagnation as an ideal. So the mental practice that underlies the anti-effort attitude is evasion, which we talked about in the past. No one seeks to evade the total of reality, writes Peikoff. Evaders believe that the practice is safe because they think they can localize it, compartmentalize it. To sustain an evasion on any single point, one would be forced to gradually expand and to keep expanding the scope of one's blindness. The issue of God's existence, which you want to accept without evidence, he says. I'm just like, oh gosh. He brings in God so many times. It's like, are you feeling insecure about something, mister? Feeling guilty? Like, why does God have anything to do with this? It's like everything he does, he wants to talk about God. I think there's a battle going on here. Middle of 225. Every fact has a relationship to other facts, and none can be evaded without tearing apart and destroying that kind of whole. An evader is not concerned with consistency. An evader's method is not to follow his evasion logically wherever it leads, but to ignore logical relationships. His method is to deal with ideas and facts piecemeal, accepting or rejecting disconnected bits of content at random. Yeah, absolutely. This is what we see in academia. This is what we see in our institutions. The evader does want the safety of localizing his evasions, so he practices the only method there is, which is not knowing that he is evaded, and not knowing the implications of these evasions, which means disregarding the principle of integration. And this is why in academia today, it's so popular to reject system building. It's because the only thing that could threaten the method that these men have embraced and been living by for years, the only thing is somebody that would come along and say, hey, wait a minute, is what you're saying consistent with this other thing? They cannot have that. Bottom of that page, a concession to the irrational invalidates one's consciousness. The mind can no more tolerate a little irrationality than the body can tolerate a little malignancy. Both evils, once introduced, start to consume any healthier elements. The virtues have to have two aspects. So this is kind of a new section here. The virtues have to have the aspect of the inner and the outer, the intellectual and the existential. Here's some material explaining that point. We don't just need to form rational conclusions, we need to act on them. If I were, say, like in my first year as a teacher, and I wrote down, this year I'm going to teach all of the students A, B, and C, but then I didn't actually write my lesson plans and then execute them, that would be not a morally good action. You have to get through the messy middle. And that's one of the hardest things in life, actually, is moving from goal to implementation. So 4 points on that. 4 obligations Peikoff lists. Your abstract values have to be turned into specific goals. You have to ask yourself, well, what are my motives? And then he says you also have to choose the means, and you have to choose those means by reference to principles. And then he says you're going to have to enact the means. That's all pretty self-explanatory. Now he writes, to seek effects without causes would mean to desire a certain object, but take no action to gain it. To seek the effect without the cause is a common problem. He also is going to have a little bit of a polemic against those who will take action to enact certain causes, but without paying attention to what the effects are. If you separate cause and effect, you've got problems. The one mentality is the one that says, I want the effect, but I'm not going to bother thinking about the cause. I just wish. The other mentality is the one that says, I just want to eat the food right now, or I just want to drink the alcohol right now, or whatever it is, and I'm not going to think about the long-term consequences. He rejects approaching life by either of those two approaches. You have to take into account the causes and the effects. Here he rejects Christian hope. He says Christian hope is not a virtue, but that's only on his construal, where Christianity has no basis in reality. It just doesn't even apply. Let's go on to the next little part. He talks about the motto of, I can get away with it. And he says you cannot get away with separating causes and effects because A is A. Long range, you won't get away with it. So if you try to do that, you're placing an I wish above an it is. But A is A. Top of 228. In epistemology, we concluded that emotions are not tools of cognition. The corollary in ethics is that they are not guides to action. A whim is a desire experienced by a person who does not know and does not care to discover the cause. This is a good principle. Be alert to whim in your life. Is there ever a time where you say to yourself, I just feel like it and I'm not going to bother analyzing my motives? I'm not going to bother thinking about the consequences. If you do that, you will almost surely find yourself in immorality. Middle of the page, the proper approach in this issue is not reason versus emotion, but reason first and then emotion. This is a lot of integrating of different ideas we've discussed in the past. And then he says, your feelings, for a rational man, they are the opposite of whims. They are consequences of rationality, and they are explicitly identified value judgments. And so he points out that if you are a person who places your emotions where they should go, which is as a consequence of your thoughts, you're going to have strong feelings. Your emotions will not be subverted. You're going to have stronger feelings than the people who are of mixed premises. It's reasonable to assume that that is the case, at least in most situations. Top of 229, the principle of objectivism is think and you shall feel. Again, imitating biblical language. Ask and you shall receive is the biblical language that he is rephrasing. It's like they cannot help but situate their ideas in biblical terms and in a biblical worldview, but objectivism is right. Think and you shall feel. I must add that anyone, for perfectly innocent reasons, may in some issue experience a clash between emotions and ideas. The rational course is then to defer the action on the issue until the clash has been resolved. Not controversial. If some emergency requires an immediate decision, then you're going to have to act without full self-knowledge. Yeah, and we could write a book on that topic of how do you act in emergencies when you don't know all the situation. What are the principles? And there are books. That's why we have books about emergencies. That's why we have manuals for different careers. Last word from Peikoff. We mean by virtue the kind of action appropriate to a human being. That is a summary of this whole material. When we talk about virtue, we're talking about what kind of actions are appropriate to the long-range conceptual human being. And so because of that, we are grounding our statements about virtue in reality. It is from the is that we are able to get the ought. And as Jacob Brunton pointed out last week, where else would you get your ought other than from an is? Like, if you think it's difficult to get an ought from an is, what do you think the alternative is? Well, we have the answers here. Morality is a science. It is something that is subject to human discovery, observation, integration, conceptualization. As controversial of a point as that might be, we're going to get even into some more controversial points in the upcoming discussion when we begin to look at the issue of rational egoism, the implication of all that we've been saying. And so I hope that you'll join us in our coming week. We meet Saturdays, 9 a.m. Eastern. And thank you for joining us this discussion for the Objectivism book study. I will talk to you soon. God bless.